بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Dear respected brothers and sisters, viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, and welcome to this program which we are with you today on the purification is half of Iman. This program, which is a fiqh based program, we're trying to explore the different implications and learn about what it means to have purification in terms of water, in terms of wudu. We spoke about toothbrushing previously, we spoke about the use of gold and silver utensils, and last time we spoke about what is the importance of wudu in terms of the actual conditions. First of all, the obligation, not the conditions, but the obligations of wudu. So we mentioned the six obligations of wudu, and we said that these are derived from the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu idha qumtum ila as-salati faghsilu wujuhakum wa aydiyakum ila al-marafiqi wamsahu bi ru'usikum wa arjulakum ila al-ka'bayn. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned if you want to get up for the salah, which is actually involves the intention, then he mentioned the four main parts, which is the face, the arms up to the elbows, wiping the head, and washing the feet. And then he also mentioned those in sequence. So these actually make up the six obligations of wudu. Then we also spoke about the different aspects of what's considered the sunan, the recommended acts of wudu, and we said that these are mainly derived from the practice of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The ayah, the verse in the Quran mentions the obligations, and the actual hadith mentions the recommended or how the Prophet ﷺ did his wudu. And we have a hadith which are numerous in this regards, because remember, this was something that was happening on a daily basis. The Prophet ﷺ was doing wudu, so people noticed his wudu, they noticed what he was doing, how he wudu, and we mentioned the whole series of recommended acts of wudu. Having said that, we're going to talk about today about the conditions of wudu, because making wudu as an obligation, the pillars of wudu are things related to the actions of wudu. The conditions are things which are outside the wudu. So for your wudu to be correct, you have to have fulfilled conditions, and the first one of these conditions is Islam. So for you to make wudu and your wudu to be correct, you have to be a Muslim, because Islam is the essence of all what we know as taklif, or the legal binding of the Sharia, the laws of Allah on a person. So if you haven't met the main obligation, which is to become a Muslim, then the other obligations are things that will follow from that. So a person who's not a Muslim and does wudu, then we don't say he has wudu, because he doesn't have Islam to start off with. Secondly, the condition of wudu is the aspect of differentiation. And by differentiation, we mean the ability for a person to differentiate between what is differentiate between things, differentiate between right and wrong. And here we're referring about the children, for example. So when we look in the Sharia perspective, Islamic perspective of children, we have children which are very young, and basically they're unable to differentiate by simple things. You know, sometimes you have a child, you give them, you give them a £10 note, they will take it, but then somebody else says, somebody may offer them a 50p pence coin, and they'd rather have that, exchange that for the piece of paper, because they feel that it's about. This is the kind of things. Or they don't know the difference between apples and oranges, for example, or they don't know how to feed themselves, or they don't know how to clean themselves. All these things, a child usually under the age of 7 is a child which does not have the ability to differentiate. So still not aware of things around him or her, and that is the level. But once they reach the age of 7, or sometimes more, so 7 is just a number which is usual for people, children at that age. When they are older than 7, then that's when they start to differentiate more. That's when they start to know, and they call it the sin tamiz. So when a child reaches that, that's again the condition for the wudu to be correct. And when we take into consideration whether or not a child has a wudu, And this is all taken from the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he said, order your children to pray at the age of 7, because that is the age when they start to become more aware of things and the differentiation relating to that. Also, in regards to differentiation, we're talking here about someone who is also mentally stable or mentally sane. And we're not talking about, mental illness is a whole spectrum of illnesses, and it's, we can't just categorize it into one. But there are some types of mental disease where the individual doesn't know who he is, doesn't know what he's doing, is totally detached from the world. So this person is not burdened by the rules. He doesn't have to pray, he doesn't have to fast, he doesn't have to do this and that, because he is someone who is not fit for the burden of the rules on him. So this person also, we would not expect him or her to be doing prayer, therefore he doesn't do wudu either. Thirdly, a condition of wudu is purity from the menses, which is the regular monthly cycle that a woman has, or postnatal bleeding. These type of bleeding which affect the woman makes her in a state of what we call as major ritual impurity, which we'll talk about later on inshallah on a different lesson. But when a woman is going through this, then making wudu for her is not correct, is not sound. You cannot make wudu when she's in that state, because she has what is known as the major ritual impurity, or al-hadath al-akbar, or al-janaba, which is a type of janaba. Also, what we talk about wudu, one of the conditions of wudu is that a person knows wudu is an obligation. So if somebody comes and says, "Oh, I'm just doing wudu just because it sounds like a good idea," or I need I think I need to do it before salah, we'll say that your wudu is not correct, because you have to actually believe that wudu is an obligation, and you have to believe about this, all the conditions of the obligation. So you don't think that something which is an obligation is in fact a sunnah. So for example, you say, I don't really need to wipe my head, it's just recommended to wipe my head or whatever, then here means that there is something wrong with your wudu, and your wudu will not be sound. So you must believe that the wudu is obligation, you must believe that every part of the wudu is that is an obligation, and not a sunnah or a recommended act. Also, one of the conditions of wudu is that you must use purifying water. So water which has the ability, which is pure in itself and has the ability to purify others. And we spoke about that in the first lesson when we spoke about the sources of water, and we spoke about aspect of used water. If you use water to wash yourself, that water that has been used no longer has the ability to be used again to purify. So that it becomes what's known as used water. So it's not purifying, it's pure, it's tahir, but it is not tahur, purifying. So for wudu to be correct, a condition must be that you use pure purifying water. You cannot do wudu with orange juice, you cannot do wudu with soap water, you cannot do wudu with rose water. It has to be water. And we mentioned the categories of water again in the first lesson. Also, it's very important that when you use the water, there must be no barrier between the water and the skin. So if you use something, you have some sort of barrier, whether it's like a heavy oily cream, that actually sometimes you see the water does not enter the skin, or it forms like a barrier. Or for example, nail varnish, again something that prevents the water reaching the nails. Something like paint, if you've been using a paint and you've got blotches of paint on your body, again this should be removed before wudu, because all these things are barrier. And also we spoke about the ring as well. So if you've got a very tight ring and doesn't allow water to enter, you have to move the ring so that water can enter into the skin. And the last condition that we're mentioning here is that water must also flow over the limbs which need washing. So when you're washing the face, it's no good just to take a bit of water and just to tap your face or tap your hands like this. It has to flow, because that is the meaning of ghusl. The ghusl, washing, has to flow, and the water is carrying away with it the actual impurity that is there as a ritual or a spiritual impurity. So those are the conditions of wudu. We're going to speak now about something else, which is what's known as the things that would nullify a person's wudu. So what is it that breaks your wudu, if you like? So there are many differences of opinion amongst the ulama about the range of things that break the wudu, because ultimately our deen is based on the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ as he taught us through the Quran. And the Prophet ﷺ taught things, and there were, in certain circumstances, people had different understandings of what was being taught, or maybe they didn't understand some of the issues, or they didn't hear some of the other practices of the Prophet ﷺ, which may have changed things or overwrought things, and that in itself would have meant that there is differences of opinion in this regards. So without doubt there's going to be differences, and different people will say differences, but here we're going to mention essentially 4 things that will nullify the wudu. So if any of one of these 4 things happens, then that's it, you don't have wudu. And the other things that may break the wudu in other madhahib or other schools of thought, or according to other ulama, what we say is that it's recommended to do wudu from them. And inshallah we'll talk about that in a moment, inshallah ta'ala. So what's the first thing that breaks a person's wudu? Well, again, we have in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, he said, أَوْ جَاءَ أَحَدٌ مِّنكُم مِّنَ الْغَائِطِ. One of the reasons that makes wudu is that when somebody actually goes, and in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us that, how to use words here. What the Prophet said is, when one of you, Allah says, when one of you goes to a low ground. See, the word al-gha'it means low ground, and that's why you have also, like in Syria, you have a place called al-ghuta, which is a low ground, because this is a place when somebody used to relieve themselves, and at that time there was no toilets and so on. People would choose a low ground, first of all so that they will be hidden from people's sight, secondly so that when they are relieving themselves, it goes into the ground and can be easily covered up. So here al-gha'it means the low ground, but later on the Arabic language used this word, which is the low ground, to actually mean the excrement of the person, which actually means gha'it. So Allah is saying that basically when you go to the toilet, this is one of the reasons that breaks the wudu, by excrement, which is more gently known as a number 2, or which is the other, which is also another form of going to the toilet, which is urinating. When a person urinates, so urinating or going to like we said, al-gha'it, going to a low place to relieve oneself, those things would break a person's wudu. And adding on to that, also the Prophet ﷺ also mentioned in another hadith, when he mentioned that in a hadith narrated by Imam Bukhari and others, is that when a person is in his praying place, and you've just prayed now, and you stay in your place remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then as long as you are in your place remembering your Allah, then the angels will pray for you. وَإِنَّ الْمَلَائِكَةَ لَتُصَلِّي عَلَىٰ أَحَدِكُمْ مَا دَامَ فِي مُصَلَّاهِ الَّذِي صَلَّى فِيهِ. The Prophet said that the angels will continue to make dua for you, they pray for you, as long as you stay in the same place that you've prayed. And then the Prophet said, مَا لَمْ يُحْدِث, as long as a person does not do a hadath. A hadath means an event. And here when Abu Hurairah, who was narrating this hadith, they asked him, what is hadath? He said, فُسَاءٌ أَوْ ضُرَاط, which basically means breaking wind. So breaking wind is described as an event which would basically mean that you've lost your ritual purity, and so therefore you have lost your wudu. So herefore the general ruling that the ulama have said, therefore in this regards, is that anything that exits the two paths, the front or the back passage, will break somebody's wudu. And that's as simple as that. And I think this is something that has been widely mentioned and understood by the ulama. So that's number 1. Number 2, we have something which is also related to this in a way, and that is when you lose conscious. That means you are no longer aware of what is happening around you. And usually, the usual way that happens for everyone on a day-to-day basis is when you go to sleep. When you go to sleep, you are no longer aware of what's happening around you. You've departed from this world in one sense. And so therefore, ultimately what has happened is that the potential to break your wudu is there. And so therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made that a reason for breaking wudu. And that's why in the hadith the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that one of the things that actually will prevent someone or will need someone to renew his wudu, he said an-nawm in a hadith when he was talking about wiping over the foot gear, which is something that we'll talk about later on. But he mentioned an-nawm. So an-nawm will break the wudu. But here, why did he mention an-nawm? Because in another hadith he said that the eye is the guard for the back passage. The eye guards the back passage. That means as long as you are awake, you're aware of what comes out of you if you break wind or so. But once your eye goes, means that you've gone to sleep, you're not aware. And that's why you make wudu when you go to sleep. And here by going to sleep, we're talking about either, going to sleep, or if you faint. If you, for example, faint, whether your blood pressure is low or you have been frightened by something or whatever the reason, or you have a heart attack or any reason that causes you to faint, your blood sugar drops, then that would also mean that your wudu has broken. Now here we have an exception though, and an exception which is taken from the practice of the Sahaba, which is as the Sahabi Anas radiallahu anhu, he said the Sahaba at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, because on one occasion the Prophet ﷺ used to delay Isha. Isha used to be delayed, so he used to pray Maghrib, and then there would be quite a long period between Maghrib and Isha, because he used to sometimes delay it till half of the night. So the Sahaba would stay in the masjid waiting for the Prophet ﷺ to come out and pray Isha. And Anas narrates that some of the Sahaba used to sit leaning on to the wall of the masjid, and they would actually doze off, and they would actually go to sleep. So they would be sitting down, they would be dozing off, and in one narration said to the extent that you can hear them blowing, like somebody who has gone into sleep, deep sleep, starts to blow, which is another form of snoring, if you like. So he said they used to do that, and then when the salah was announced, they would get up to pray without renewing their wudu. And obviously the Prophet ﷺ was witnessing this, he was seeing what's happening, he never told anybody to get up and do wudu. Why? Because when they were sitting and when they were sleeping, they were sitting down with their bottoms firmly on the ground. And if their bottoms are firmly on the ground, that means the initial thing which we talk about when the eye is guarding the back passage is no longer applicable here, because there is no chance here of breaking wind. So that's why in that scenario we say that their wudu is still valid, still intact. So the second thing that breaks the wudu, we said, is loss of consciousness or sleep, as long when a person is not placing his bottom firmly on the ground. If your bottom is firmly on the ground, you go to sleep, we say that doesn't break the wudu. And in fact, one of the things that the Prophet ﷺ disliked was something called al-ihtiba. Al-ihtiba basically is when you bring your knees, when you're sitting on the floor, you bring your knees up to your chest and you put your hands around them. It's a form of sitting. Some people sit like that. And he disliked that a person does that at the time of Jumu'ah when he's listening to the khatib. Basically, essentially for two reasons. One is when you do that, and even we have in some cultures, I know for example in Yemen they do it, they have like a special even band, like a cloth, which they actually put around them, which holds them in that position, so that they don't have to tie their hands like that. But the problem with that is that first of all, you're like that, there's more likeliness that you will doze off, because it's like almost like a comfortable position. It's like somebody holding you tight. And secondly, in that position with your bottom is off the ground, is more likely for, if you do sleep, that you will break wind, and therefore while you're listening to a khutbah and you doze off for a minute or so, that's it. You have to go and therefore renew your wudu. So those are the two things that break wudu. The third thing that breaks wudu is touching one's private parts, whether frontal or the rear passage. And that is the thing that obviously has been taken from a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And inshallah, we're going to go to a break in a short moment, and then after we come back from the break, we will continue to discuss this point, which is touching the private parts, whether it's front or back, and we'll just mention the hadith or the evidence relating to that, inshallah ta'ala. So stay with us and be with us after the break. And remember, this session is, there is opportunities for you to ask questions, so you should be seeing a telephone number in front of you. So give us a call after the break. We're happy to answer your questions on this topic. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to your program. This program, Purification, half of Iman. Before the break, we were speaking about things that break the wudu, and we mentioned two things up to now. We mentioned anything that exits the two passages, whether it's air, whether it's liquid, whether it's excrement, etc. Then we said the second thing that breaks a person's wudu is loss of consciousness by sleeping if a person's bottom's not firmly on the ground. The third thing that we also mentioned briefly, which is touching the private parts. Now, again, there's something that is different amongst the scholars, because essentially there's two ahadith. One hadith where the Prophet ﷺ has mentioned that a person who touches his private part, and he was talking to the Sahaba about the male organ, basically, when he said that if you touch that, then you have to make wudu. And so based on that, the ulama who took this hadith, they made it part of breaking wudu if a person touches his private parts. And then they measured onto that issues related to not just the front but also the rear. So touching the front private part, but also touching the rear private one. By the rear, and I mean this is obviously aspect of our deen where we have to talk about it, because you have to learn the Islam, is that also touching what we call the anal sphincter. So that part of the body, if it is touched, breaks the wudu. The male organ, if that's touched, breaks the wudu, and the female private parts as well. I think we have a question, telephone question. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Yes, assalamu alaikum. You're live on air. What is your question?
I don't have a particular question. I just wanted to say that it's a very good program that you have here, and it will be very useful for children in particular. So I just want to say continue the good work.
Oh, jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much.
Okay.
It's nice to get words of encouragement. So jazakallah khair. Thank you very much, and may Allah reward you. And for the rest of our viewers, obviously we do invite you to phone in. If you'd like to put a question through, then you are more than welcome to phone in and put a question. So that is the third thing that breaks the wudu, which is touching the front or rear private parts. And obviously by touching, the ulama are talking about touching meaning without any barrier. So if a person, it's skin to skin touch as opposed to a barrier. So if somebody's covered and touching, that does not break the wudu. And also further to that, the touching here is directed to what's considered the inside of the hand. The inside of the hand, because that is showing that there is an intention, or there is a direction to touch. So if a person touches his private parts with the inside of his legs, that doesn't break his wudu. Or from the back of his hand, again, doesn't break the wudu. So how do we know what is the inside of the hands? Basically simple. If you go like this, anything that is not seen here is considered the inside of the hands. So for example, we can see the tips of the fingers. That means touching with the tips does not break the wudu. and similar anything, and for the thumbs it's that. So anything that, so basically it's the inside of the hand. So anything that cannot be seen when you go like this is considered the inside of the hand. So that is the third thing that breaks the wudu in according to the scholars. Some of the scholars obviously they said no, it doesn't break the wudu, and that is a different opinion based again on another hadith. The fourth and last thing that breaks a person's wudu is something which again the Quran mentions when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ, or if you touch the women. So touching a woman, according to this verse in the Quran, is a reason for breaking wudu. And by touching here a woman means the touching a man touching a woman, or obviously vice versa as well. Both of them will lose their wudu. And by touching, we're going to explain what we mean by touching, and we're going to explain by the different categories that we talk about in terms of women and the different types. Now, touching women breaking wudu is something that the majority of scholars follow as an opinion. So it is an opinion in the Maliki school, it's an opinion in the Shafi'i school, it's an opinion in the Hanafi school, because they are basing it on the verse of the Quran, and also not only on the verse but also on how the Sahaba, a lot of the Sahaba, not all of them, but a lot of the Sahaba understood that as well. So first of all, we have the verse in the Quran. Now some of the scholars who said no, it doesn't mean that, it actually means something else. It means the relationship that a man has with his wife. That is what results in losing the wudu and ultimately the major impurity. What we say is that the Quran generally, there is a principle that we have which is called al-aslu fil kalam al-haqiqa, is that when we take words specifically, usually they are taken to mean literally or real. So when we don't try and go to the metaphorical meaning of a word or a term unnecessarily. We take the meaning as it is, unless there is a reason which makes us understand that the meaning of this word or this verse or this phrase is metaphorical, then we do that. So lamastum, which comes from the word lamasa, which means to touch, is that's it. We don't need to go to the other meaning, which is an implied meaning. Secondly, we have the saying of the Prophet ﷺ, where he mentions the word lamas as something different from a man's relation with a wife, i.e. intercourse. Because in the hadith of that person who committed adultery, and he came to the Prophet ﷺ and he complained, he said, "O Messenger of Allah, I've committed a sin, I want you to purify me." And the Prophet ﷺ turned away from him because he didn't want to he didn't want to impose the law on him. So he kept on insisting on the Prophet, and the Prophet turned away. He came and turned and sat in front of the Prophet and said, "O Messenger of Allah, I've committed a sin, so purify me." And the Prophet continued to turn away from him. And in the end, after 4 times, the Prophet ﷺ said, "لَعَلَّكَ لَمَسْتَ," maybe you just touched the woman. Maybe you didn't commit something haram, something which is punishable, but maybe you just touched. And here we took the word "maybe you just touched," showing that there is a difference between lems, which is the touching, and between the act which is punishable, which is the act of zina or fornication or adultery, that is punishable. And because the touching of a woman, even if it's by haram ways, is not punishable in the same way that fornication or adultery is punished. Now some people will say, okay, well, what do you say about the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ used to kiss his wives before going to the salah and without making wudu? We say that this hadith is not a sahih hadith. It's a weak hadith, as has been stated by some big hadith scholars, masters, huffaz, who said that this hadith where the Prophet ﷺ used to kiss his wives then go to the salah is not a sound hadith. So if it's not a sound hadith, we cannot build any rule on it. They say, okay, what about the hadith when the Prophet ﷺ was praying in sujood And then Aisha radiallahu anha, she extended her hand to see where the Prophet was, and she held his feet, or she could feel his feet as he was doing sujood. Doesn't that show that if the touching breaks the wudu? We say yes, but is there a possibility that the Prophet ﷺ was wearing socks or wearing leather? We don't know. Is it possible? It is possible. So how can we then make a definite answer here without knowing whether the Prophet was wearing socks or not? Because he could be wearing socks, or his feet could be covered. And if his feet are covered, we've already said that the touching is skin to skin. And so therefore it does not break the wudu if there are socks. And therefore that is not a reason. But this, I'm just giving you some of the understanding, because obviously this topic is a topic which is important for us to know, and this is important to understand how the scholars derive their opinions and how sometimes they have these different debates in this matter. Now, some of the scholars, they went to say, look, there's a specific type of touching, and touching by touching or lems, we're talking about skin to skin. So we're not talking about things which are not skin, things which don't have nerve endings, if you like. So they excluded things like hair, teeth, nails, because they are not skin. So if a man touches the hair of his wife, that does not break wudu, or vice versa. Nobody sort of generally goes and just touches the teeth, but as an example. So that is something that would not break the wudu. Second, another point to note here as well is that it's not any touching. So it's not any man touching any woman. No, it is touching a man touching a woman who can be married. So it is a woman who potentially can be married. A woman who cannot be married, which is what we call mahram in Islam, does not break a wudu. So a man touching his mother does not break a wudu. A man touching his sister does not break a wudu. His daughter, all those categories of women which he cannot marry, his mother-in-law, his auntie, his niece, all these categories, his sister from breastfeeding, all these women he cannot marry. We say that these women, touching them does not break the wudu. It's only a person's wife or any woman which potentially he can marry. So when we say potentially, because maybe a woman is married to somebody else, he cannot marry her. But if she wasn't married, could he marry her? And if the answer is yes, then we say that touching would break the wudu. And the last point to note here is that some scholars in some of the madhahib, they linked the touching to something which is here. They said it's not any touching, it's a touching which is accompanied by desire. And they linked it to an internal thing. And while that is an opinion, and a scholarly opinion attributed to the Maliki school, but the other schools like Al-Shafi'i and Al-Hanafi, Al-Hanbali, they said that the desire or the internal thing is something that we cannot measure. And usually things that break wudu are not related to intention. So things that are not related to intention, we don't enter it. So you can't say, look, I didn't intend to go to sleep, I just fell asleep. We say, it doesn't matter what your intention was. End of the day, you fell asleep, that's it, you lost wudu. I didn't intend to break wind. We say that's it, there's no intention related here to it. So therefore the desire, which is an internal thing, we say it has no reasoning for breaking the wudu. So those are the four things that we consider are the things that break the wudu. Other things are some issues which are different opinion, either that the Prophet ﷺ did them initially and then he changed, like for example eating cooked meat. Eating cooked meat, initially the Prophet used to make wudu from eating cooked meat, but then he stopped doing that, showing that that is no longer necessary. Things like eating camel meat, again, according to some scholars you have to do wudu, but according to others you don't. And that is the opinion that we follow, which is that you don't have to do wudu. It's the opinion of a lot of the Sahaba, and even Abdullah ibn Abbas, he said wudu is from that which exits from you, not that which enters you. Yani things which break your wudu are a result of things that exit from you, not things that you put inside you. And also because the hadith, when the Prophet ﷺ was asked, shall we make wudu from eating sheep's meat? He said no. They said, shall we make wudu from eating camel's meat? He said yes. Now this hadith, you might say, okay, well that's a clear hadith. It's saying yes, you make wudu. But what some of the scholars said, they said, when the Prophet was asked, shall we make wudu from eating camel's meat? And he said yes. This yes can either note an obligation, meaning yes, you must make wudu, or it could be yes, it's recommended to do wudu. So here again, there is a possibility of either he's saying yes, you must, or yes, it's a recommended. And because we have that possibility, then again we are saying that that is not a reason for us to therefore make that as a thing which nullifies wudu. Also other issues like nose bleeding, having blood taken, having hijama, even sleeping while your bottom is firm on the ground. All these things, although we say they don't break wudu, but we say it's recommended that if you do them, go and make wudu. So always try and leave yourself away from the areas which there's difference of opinion. So for example, you are sitting and somebody brought you some camel meat and you ate and you enjoyed the meal. We say, even though it doesn't break your wudu, we don't believe that it breaks your wudu, we say it's recommended for you to go and renew your wudu, because at least in one school or one opinion that does break your wudu, and so therefore to keep yourself away from that, or from a nosebleed, or loss of lot of blood, or etc. These other things that we mentioned. We also, in this point here, we mentioned there's also lots of times which recommended to do wudu. And other times, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us when we need to do wudu, and essentially you need wudu for three things, essentially. One is salah, because inna Allah la yaqbalu salatan bighayri tahur. So you have to have salah. Secondly, tawaf, which is going around the Kaaba, tawaf, because the Prophet said, at-tawafu salah, غَيْرَ أَنَّ لَنَا أَن نَتَكَلَّمْ. The tawaf is a type of salah, but the only difference is you can speak during this salah. And thirdly, for touching the mushaf or carrying it, you need wudu as well, because the Prophet ﷺ in a hadith, he said, لا يمس القرآن إلا طاهر. In a hadith, لا يمس القرآن إلا طاهر, which may or may not be the explanation of the verse لا يمسه إلا المطهرون, which there's a difference of opinion whether that's referring to the humans or whether it's referring to the angels. لا يمسه إلا المطهرون in Surah Al-Waqi'ah, it's not touched except by those who are pure or purified. But definitely in the hadith said لا يمس القرآن إلا طاهر, only someone who has tahara can touch the Quran or carry it. So those are the three things. And inshallah next time we'll talk about some of the recommended acts that a person should do, for recommended times for doing wudu. So dear respected viewers, you've been with us on this program. Purification is half of Iman. We've spoken about the important conditions of wudu and that which breaks the wudu. And inshallah join us next week at 7 o'clock on Wednesday to carry on with this important topic. Until then, we say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.